The morning of the 8th of May, 1902, began with church bells. It was Ascension Thursday, a holy day. The bakeries on Rue Victor Hugo had opened before sunrise, and the smell of fresh bread moved through the streets of Saint-Pierre in the warm Caribbean air. Children were dressed for Mass. Merchants were unlocking their shutters. And on the waterfront, sailors from 18 ships, anchored in the harbor, were watching the mountain above the city with a quiet, growing unease that none of them could quite put into words. For weeks, Mount Pelée had been speaking, and for weeks the people in power had chosen not to listen. Saint-Pierre, in 1902, was not simply a city. It was the jewel of the French Antilles, the cultural and commercial capital of Martinique, a French colonial island in the southern Caribbean. Its population hovered around 30,000. It had an opera house. It had electric streetcars. It had a cathedral with walls thick enough to survive a hurricane. The French colonists who built it called it the Paris of the Caribbean, and they meant it without a trace of irony. Cafes lined the boulevards. The harbor was one of the most active in the region, handling sugar, rum, and cacao bound for metropolitan France. And directly to the north, 4 kilometers from the city center, rose the dark green cone of Mount Pelée, 1,397 meters of volcanic rock that had been dormant, or apparently dormant, for the better part of 50 years. It was not dormant anymore. The first signs had appeared in early February of 1902. Fumarole's vents exhaling sulfurous gas began reactivating near the summit. The smell of rotten eggs drifted down into the northern neighborhoods. Workers on the sugar plantations on the mountain's lower slopes began reporting tremors in the ground beneath their feet, small and rhythmic, like something vast and subterranean shifting its weight. By late March, ash was falling on the city, fine gray powder on the cafe tables, fine gray powder on the fresh bread. People wiped it off and went about their business. By April, the situation had crossed from unsettling into something harder to dismiss. The Rivière Blanche, the White River, which descended from the crater and emptied into the sea north of Saint-Pierre, was running hot. Boiling mud cascaded down its banks. The wildlife on the upper slopes of Pelée began moving in ways that animals move only when the ground beneath them has become something to fear. Thousands of fer-de-lance snakes, among the most venomous pit vipers in the Western Hemisphere, descended from the mountainside and poured into the northern suburb of Le Prêcheur and the plantation district of Parnasse. In the days that followed, approximately 50 horses and 200 cattle were killed by snakebite. At least 50 people died as well. And still, Saint-Pierre did not evacuate. There was a reason for that. There were actually 2 reasons, and they were intertwined in the specific, ugly way that political ambition and institutional negligence so often are. The first reason was institutional. The Colonial Scientific Commission assembled to assess the threat was composed largely of men with no volcanological expertise. They visited the crater. They filed a report. Their report, dated May 7th, one day before the eruption, concluded that the population of Saint-Pierre had no cause for alarm. The commission was not staffed with volcanologists from metropolitan France. There were no volcanologists from metropolitan France. The assessment was made by local academics and a military officer who, by his own subsequent admission, had no prior experience evaluating volcanic risk. The second reason was Governor Louis Moutet. Moutet had been appointed governor of Martinique by the French colonial administration in Paris. He was a career bureaucrat, methodical, status-conscious, and acutely aware that the elections of the 11th of May, 1902, were 3 days away. The elections mattered enormously to him. The political alignment of Martinique's legislative seats mattered to the colonial administration in Paris, and therefore to Moutet's future career. And the votes that would decide those seats were concentrated, overwhelmingly, in the city of Saint-Pierre. If Saint-Pierre evacuated, the voters left. If the voters left, the election results became unpredictable. And so, on May 2nd, Governor Moutet published an editorial in the official colonial newspaper, Les Colonies, assuring the population that the mountain posed no mortal threat. He organized a scientific commission whose findings he appears to have anticipated before the investigation was complete. And on May 7th, the day before the cataclysm, he and his wife, Gabrielle, traveled personally from the capital Fort-de-France to Saint-Pierre, both to reinforce the message of calm and, according to historical accounts, to demonstrate it by their physical presence in the threatened city. The governor and his wife would not survive the night. They were not the only ones who had been persuaded to stay. Military authorities had established roadblocks on the roads south out of Saint-Pierre. Documented accounts confirm that residents attempting to flee the city in the days leading up to the 8th were turned back, directed home by soldiers instructed to prevent panic. The roadblocks were not a rumor. They are in the administrative record. 30,000 people were held inside a city that had 4 kilometers of space between its streets and a volcano that had been showing catastrophic warning signs for 3 months. At 7:50, 2 inches the morning of the 8th of May 1902, Mount Pelée did not erupt in the way most people in 1902 understood volcanic eruptions to work. There was no towering column of lava pouring down its slopes in a slow, visible river that would give people time to run. What Pelée produced was something that the science of that era had no established name for, a phenomenon that would only be formally defined and studied as a direct result of what happened that morning. It was a pyroclastic density current, called a nuée ardente, a glowing cloud, by the French geologist Alfred Lacroix, who studied the aftermath. The southern flank of the mountain's crater did not hold. A lateral blast, not a vertical eruption column, but a horizontal explosion tore through the crater wall and sent a superheated mixture of volcanic gas, ash, and fragmented rock rolling down the mountain's southern slope at speeds later estimated between 160 and 670 kilometers per hour. The temperature within the flow has been estimated at somewhere between 700 and 1,000 degrees Celsius. It was not lava. It was not a mudslide. It was not anything that the people of Saint-Pierre had a cultural framework for understanding. It was a wave of fire moving at the speed of a hurricane. The cloud reached the outer northern neighborhoods of Saint-Pierre in approximately 60 seconds. It hit the city center in under 2 minutes. The rooftops of the French colonial buildings, those thick-walled structures that had survived every hurricane on record, offered no resistance. The stone walls cracked. The iron shutters buckled inward. The wooden interior structures of every building in the city ignited simultaneously, as if the air itself had caught fire, because in every practical sense it had. The rum distilleries in the harbor district ruptured. Thousands of barrels of aging rum exploded in sequence. The harbor water boiled. Every ship in the anchorage was struck. Some capsized, some caught fire. Some were swept by the shockwave and the thermal pulse simultaneously. In the British passenger vessel, Rotterdam, which was moored in the harbor, the log entry for that morning, later recovered by investigators, recorded that the ship was struck by what the surviving crew described as a wall of burning gas and solid matter falling from the sky. The Rotterdam lost most of her crew and her rigging. She was the only ship in the harbor to escape. Her captain, Edward Freeman, had been badly burned. He managed to navigate out of the harbor on instinct and partial vision. The vessel reached the island of St. Lucia hours later, still smoldering. The cable station operator at Saint-Pierre, Roger Arnoux, had been transmitting regular updates to Fort-de-France in the days leading up to May 8th. His final transmission, recorded at the cable office in Fort-de-France, came at 7:50 inches the morning, 2 minutes before the eruption. It described a massive ash cloud rising from the summit and asked for instructions. There were no further transmissions from Saint-Pierre, ever. The silence, when it came, was total. In Fort-de-France, 25 kilometers south, the telegraph operators waited for a response that did not come. Then they felt the shockwave, a low, sustained pressure in the air, like a door slamming in a room the size of the sky. The sky above Saint-Pierre turned black. Ash began falling on Fort-de-France within the hour, gray and warm, and carrying the smell of sulfur and something else beneath it, something that had no clean description and that people would not speak about directly in the days that followed. Of the 30,000 people estimated to have been in Saint-Pierre on the morning of the 8th of May 1902, the number of confirmed survivors within the city's perimeter was 2. The first was Auguste Siparis, also recorded in some documents as Louis Auguste Silbaris. He was a prisoner. He had been jailed 2 days earlier following a bar fight, and he was being held in the city's underground dungeon, a stone cell with a single small vented opening facing away from the volcano. The pyroclastic surge penetrated even that confined space. Saint-Pierre was severely burned on his legs, arms, and back. He survived by some combination of the cell's stone construction, the restricted airflow through the single vent, and the direction the vent faced. He was not discovered until 4 days after the eruption, when rescue teams picking through the ruins of the city heard something tapping against the stone. He spent months recovering from his injuries. He later joined the Barnum and Bailey Circus, where he toured as a living exhibit for years, demonstrating his burns and telling his story to audiences across North America who did not, by and large, know what Mount Pelée was. The second survivor was Léon Compère Léandre, a shoemaker who lived on the extreme southern edge of the city. He survived in his stone house, with severe burns to his extremities, and later gave testimony that was recorded by Lacroix and other investigators. He described the moment of impact as a sudden, blinding heat, not preceded by any sound that he recognized. The heat came first, then the darkness, then, eventually, silence. The governor, his wife, the scientific commission, the soldiers manning the roadblocks, the merchants, the priests, the sailors, the children in their Ascension Thursday clothes. Gone. In the days after the eruption, a French naval relief expedition made its way into the harbor. The reports filed by the naval officers described a landscape that had no contemporary reference point. Every building in Saint-Pierre had been destroyed or severely damaged. The cathedral's walls, which had been among the sturdiest in the Caribbean, were standing, but the interior had been entirely consumed by fire. The iron frames of the streetcar tracks had been twisted and displaced. The steel hulls of the ships sunk in the harbor were still visible below the surface of the water, which remained abnormally warm. One officer noted in his report that the silence in the harbor was the most disturbing element of what he witnessed. He had expected, at some level, to find survivors calling for help. He found no one calling. He found no sound at all, except the water and the wind, and the occasional distant groan of a wall somewhere in the ruins deciding, at last, to fall. Alfred Lacroix, the French geologist who arrived weeks later and spent months documenting the eruption, calculated that the pyroclastic density current had covered an area of approximately 50 square kilometers. He documented the destruction of 17 villages and settlements, in addition to Saint-Pierre itself. His research, published over the following years, became foundational to the modern science of volcanology. The phenomenon he observed and named the Nuée Ardente defined an entirely new category of volcanic hazard that researchers had not previously characterized in systematic terms. The world learned what a pyroclastic surge was, because 30,000 people died in one. The investigation that followed the disaster was, by modern standards, inadequate. The colonial administration in Paris received the reports. Governor Moutet was, of course, no longer alive to answer questions. The scientists who had signed the May 7th report, stating that Saint-Pierre was safe, were largely discredited in the French scientific press, though no formal legal proceedings resulted. The roadblocks, and the deliberate policy of preventing evacuation for electoral purposes, were documented in the colonial administrative record, but the administrative apparatus that had ordered them had largely been destroyed along with the city it governed. There was no trial. There was no reckoning in any formal legal sense. There was a disaster fund. There was reconstruction of Fort de France. There was a French state monument to the dead, erected years later. Saint-Pierre was rebuilt, eventually. It exists today as a smaller town of approximately 4,000 people. Divers come to explore the wrecks of the 18 ships that lie on the floor of the harbor. Among them, the Roraima, an American passenger and cargo ship on which most of the crew and passengers died, and whose assistant purser, Clara King, survived with severe burns, and later gave one of the most detailed first-person accounts of the harbor as the pyroclastic cloud hit. She described seeing the mountain open, that was her word. Open, and then a darkness, she said, felt solid, as if the air had become something with weight. She died in a hospital in Fort-de-France 3 weeks later. The wreck of the Roraima sits in approximately 50 meters of water. It is considered one of the most historically significant dive sites in the Caribbean. Mount Pelée erupted again in 1929. It produced a smaller pyroclastic event, smaller but not small. By 1929, the population living near the volcano had been substantially reduced from 1,902 levels, and an evacuation was ordered. The evacuation was conducted. Nobody died. The difference between 1,902 and 1,929 was not the volcano. The volcano did what volcanoes do. The difference was whether the people responsible for the decision to stay or leave chose to act on what the mountain was telling them. In 1902, the mountain had been telling them for 3 months. It told them with sulfur in the air and hot mud in the river and snakes pouring out of the forest and ash settling on everything every morning for weeks on end. The people who could have ordered an evacuation received all of that information. They waited against an election, and they made their decision. 30,000 people paid for that decision with their lives. In 2 minutes, on a Thursday morning that had started with church bells and the smell of fresh bread. Pelée still stands above what remains of Saint-Pierre. Its slopes are green again. The crater has been quiet for decades. Seismological monitoring stations on the island transmit data continuously to research institutions in France and the Caribbean. Volcanologists track every tremor, every shift in gas output, every change in the temperature of the springs on the mountain's flanks. The monitoring exists because the world remembers what happens when it doesn't. But monitoring is only useful if the people who receive the data are willing to act on it. And the archive of what happened in 1902 is, at its core, not a story about a volcano. The volcano behaved exactly as the geology required. The archive is a story about a system, a colonial administrative system, a scientific advisory system, a political system that processed overwhelming evidence of catastrophic risk and returned, as its output, a decision to do nothing. The most dangerous thing about Mount Pelée in May of 1902 was not the pyroclastic surge. It was the official report, published on May 7th, that said there was nothing to worry about. The ash from the 1,902 eruption was found, in soil surveys conducted decades later, distributed across an area extending hundreds of kilometers from Martinique. Fine gray particles, pressed into the geological record like a signature. Geologists use layers like that to date and identify ancient volcanic events going back thousands of years, each layer a record of something that happened, something that was survived or wasn't, something that changed the landscape permanently, and then was buried under the slow accumulation of ordinary time. Somewhere in the soil of Martinique, there is a layer from the 8th of May, 1902. It is not thick. Pyroclastic surges do not deposit the same volumes of material as slow-moving lava flows. But it is there, fine and gray and uniform, laid down in less than 2 minutes, spread across the northern part of the island, like a burial shroud pulled flat by the wind. Below that layer, there is the world that existed before 0 inches the morning on Ascension Thursday. Above it, there is everything that came after. And in between, in the layer itself, there is the record of what happens when the warning is given and the warning is ignored, and the mountain, indifferent to elections and editorials and the ambitions of colonial administrators, does exactly what it was always going to do.